really kind of interesting. I'll go through some of the reasons why it's an interesting topic, because mostly people believe in the supernatural. But I want to explain what I mean by the supernatural. And so you see that the supernatural and the miraculous are not exactly the same thing. They're overlapping realities. And so the supernatural. When we talk about the supernatural, the supernatural is something that is not about the laws of nature, right? I mean, we think we know how the laws of nature work, but there is this different world. Can we all kind of agree on that? But I will tell you, because you agree on that, that's the product of the Enlightenment. And so you think about that because that's how we've come to think about it. It's not how early Christians thought about it or medieval Christians thought about it. And it's really not the way the world really is from our Christian faith. So here's the thing, and I'll just say this, all is in one place: the natural, the preternatural, and the supernatural. The preternatural, that word, probably not many of you are familiar with it, but if I explain it, you'll understand it, okay? So the natural is what I think we all agree on. It's the world that science can experiment on. The preternatural is created reality, and this is our tradition. Whether you believe in the preternatural or not is kind of an individual thing. But the preternatural would be the world of ghosts. It's the world of demons and angels, because remember, we believe everything's created, right? And so there's no demon that could be God. There's no angel that's God. There is one divine being in the supernatural world, and that is God. Does that make sense? If you want to see a good image of it and to how it works out, if you ever read, it would be a great book club read, is the Divine Comedy, except it's a lot. But the Divine Comedy goes from this world down to the center of the world where Satan is, not because the world is at the center of reality. It's because the center of the world is as far as you can go in reality to get away from God. Do you see the difference? So when the Enlightenment says that in the Christian world, man was at the center of it, no. Man was as far away from God as you could get without going to hell. Does this make sense? And then you come out the other side, and there's a mountain called Purgatory that goes up into the heavens, and that's the Purgatorio, and it's about cleansing from sin. And then you go into the Paradiso, which is about the spheres, and this is how the medieval world thought about reality, that there is these different spheres where you get out to the very end, and that very end is that blackness out there with light shining through it. That's the Empyrean, okay? And the Empyrean is the light shining through, that's God, in this blackness out there. Does that make sense? Now, that's a very different way than we look at an expanding universe, right? The idea of it, however, is it tells you that there's one world, it's a sacred world, and everything is part of that world at one level or another. This is the enchanted world, okay? It's why John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, who both have the impossible as part of their life, they'll tell you that their visions, their St. Teresa's transverberation, I'll talk about her levitations, all of this is not God for them. It's God's world, okay? But that it is not itself God. Do you understand that? And so it's this preternatural world. It's what happens when the love of God permeates all of reality. How's the modern, when I said the nature and supernatural, remember, I didn't mention preternatural, which has kind of disappeared. Think of it as like a two-story house. Once you leave this world, you go into another world. St. Paul talks about going into the third heaven, or the seventh heaven, I think it was. But that's still part of this world. It's not leaving this world. And so that tonight when I talk about the supernatural, I'm going to contrast the enchanted world, and I'll talk a little bit about that because it still has a huge effect on how we think about all of this. And then a little bit about the supernatural world. And so this is a key thing because we're all Christians here. Is there somebody not Christian? I was going to say, throw them out. Wailing and grinding of teeth out there. Okay, this is from St. Paul, the very first chapter of 1 Corinthians, okay? When I came to you, brothers and sisters, proclaiming the mystery of God, I did not come with sublimity of words or of wisdom, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you, except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness and fear and much trembling. And my message and my proclamation were not with persuasive words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of spirit and power. Do you get that last part? So it isn't I had the best argument on the street. I came in the spirit and the power. And so St. Paul performs miracles. Why would anyone pay attention to Jesus without the miraculous? You remember I said that the miraculous and the supernatural are not the same thing, but they're overlapping realities? Like when Jesus casts out a demon, you got to say that's something about the preternatural. Fair enough? Yes. Okay. When he heals somebody, well, doctors can heal, right? But doctors don't heal like he heals. So it's something within nature, isn't it? Would anyone pay any attention to Jesus but for all of that? For raising someone from the dead? You know, when they talk about the resurrection, the Jewish opponents of Christianity, the only thing they argued, and it's in the scriptures, it's in Matthew, they claimed that his disciples stole the body. Did you hear that? That's in the Bible. Because everyone agreed the tomb was empty. That's just a fact. You can believe why it's empty for whatever reason you want. This is where faith comes in. But that the miraculous is shot through. And so to think of Christianity as just a better way of living, we'll get to that in a minute because that's true. I mean, I don't know, do you know who Richard Dawkins is? And he was very anti-Christian. He said religion was an evil thing. Do you remember all this? The four horsemen of the new atheism, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Dennett and Hitchens are both in heaven with God, we hope, right now, because they're both gone. Harris has kind of gone on to other things. But Dawkins came out in March and said he's decided he's a cultural Christian. Did you hear this? I mentioned it at Sunday Mass. It's just how either you don't show up for Mass or you don't listen when I talk. Which is not impossible, by the way. But the thing about it is, and I don't know if you're ever looking for interesting historical reading material, try Dominion by Tom Holland. And it's why the world lives in a Christian world. How much Christianity has changed the world. Social justice, the roles of women, why Islam gets criticized. We're going to go into the secular world in a minute. But what prompted me to do this was, did you note that the Vatican in May came out with new rules about the supernatural? I don't know if you saw that. 6 different things. See, this is why you have a pastor that reads. And so it's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. And it will not say any more about anything that it's supernatural. It will say it's not supernatural. And it will say there's really nothing to prohibit you from believing it's supernatural, like Lourdes, right? But you don't have to believe it. What you have in the gospel and in the sacraments is you have the ordinary means of sanctification. And so whether you believe in Lourdes or Fatima or not, this is not like a step to heaven, right? All of these things, the miraculous and the supernatural, here's what makes something as a miracle. A miracle is a sign. That's why John calls them signs in his gospel. Semeions, I think it is, or semeions, and maybe is that the word? I know, I'm screwing it up. But the idea is that God's communicating something to us. God wants to heal us. God wants to forgive us. The resurrection, there's something more, and this is what it looks like. We could not in principle understand it in this world, but this is how you can at least take a step towards it. so you understand what's at stake. That's what a miracle is. If you're in your living room and a ghost walks through, is that a miracle by how I just defined it? No, it's supernatural or preternatural, right? But the miraculous is something God does to get our attention. So the Vatican wants to supervise it because there are so many claims, and some of them are just absolutely crazy. When I went out to Yuma, there was a man that claimed that the Virgin Mary was appearing in a mesquite tree in his front yard. And people would come and put their chairs down up at, and watch it, but the bishop wouldn't tolerate it. Up in Eloy, at the church up there, St. Helens, when they would turn on the lights at night, the image of the Blessed Virgin Mary would appear on the bell tower, and people would go there. But Father Martinez, who's now down in Swarita, would point out, she appears, now she disappears. She appears, now she disappears. So he had a little thing in his bulletin, Mary, appearing nightly. Because it only happened when the lights were on in this, and how the shadow works, right? And so imaginative vision, St. Francis would walk by a field and he'd see a lamb out in the middle of the field feeding, and he'd see, behold the Lamb of God. And so imaginative visions as ways of thinking about God in nature, these are not bad things, but it's not the same thing as saying, Our Blessed Lady appeared to St. Bernadette Soubirous at Lourdes in the 1850s, is it? Different kinds of things. Imaginative visions, actual corporeal appearances, these kinds of things are what is about the miraculous in our tradition. And so why is it, I think this is interesting, has anybody here read the book or heard of the book, A Secular Age by Charles Taylor? It's a huge book. It's like almost 900 pages. But what he's a Catholic, he's a philosopher from Canada, and it's a brilliant book. But what he tries to explain is, why is it that in the year 1500, it was inconceivable not to believe in God? But in the year 2024, it's just one more option. Does that make sense, how much it's changed? And if you had to tell that story, how would you tell it? Because it's not clear how we got here. But what he does a brilliant job of is showing all the factors involved. So what happens, he says, when the Franciscans start teaching that you can meet God in church, but you also have to have your own personal prayer life, right? Would you understand that as a Christian? Do you think that your personal prayer life supplants receiving the Eucharist at Mass? It's because you believe that that's a miracle. Something supernatural is happening there that's not available to you on your own terms. But what if you decide that's not so? And that's almost all of Protestantism. And then Christianity becomes kind of a privatized religion. And then you get to decide what the scriptures mean. And one of his points is when you become the arbiter of what reality is, then believing in God like a Catholic would believe in God in the year 1500 and before is just optional. It's just one of many possible beliefs. And so what's interesting is how the belief in the supernatural endures. And so I'm going to go to a Pew report that came out in the early part of this year. And it says that 70% of Americans consider themselves spiritual. And 83% believe in the soul. How they might define that, maybe it's not the same thing as Thomas Aquinas. 81% believe the spirit is beyond nature. So this is some of the comments that came in from people who are trying, and you've probably heard this from friends, maybe kids, about spirituality. Here's a comment. To me, spiritual means to be in touch with nature, see the beauty in everything, feel the love of Mother Nature, to know that there is something out there that is greater than me. That's one idea of what spirituality is. And it's something we'll talk about next month when we talk about the immanent frame, cosmic connections. And so have anyone ever had someone say, I get in touch with God by being in nature? Okay, that's a very common thing. And I say it's almost always a beautiful sunrise coming up over a canyon, right? I mean, that's pretty awesome. But because I'm a smart aleck, one of 8 kids, I always like to point out, oh, do you mean like rotting corpses? Rattlesnakes eating baby bunnies? This is nature. Is this how you understand God? Because that would be paganism. That's the God of nature. But obviously, a different thing going on. How about this? The belief that a supreme being, is God the supreme being? How many were taught that? You know, I think there's a huge influence of Protestantism on Catholicism. Here's the problem with the supreme being, and it's all about how we're talking about God and the supernatural. The supreme being is, we exist, right? And so is God like me times 1,000 trillion billion? You see what the problem is? And so that's called a, what is it called? A voluntarist view of God? But that the idea is there's just one kind of existence, and God is at the extreme end of that. We have an analogous view of God, which is God is nothing in the world. God does not exist in the cosmos. God is present everywhere, including the cosmos. But God exists, and the cosmos exists in God. He's in his own category. And so you couldn't even understand God. So even if you look at the Jewish understandings of God, it's always like 70 eyes, whirling wheels, wings, someone like the figure of a man, but his body was made of jasper. Do you remember all this? Or they go to have a meal with God up on Mount Sinai, and they're looking like through gemstones, and they see God appear eating with them. But it's unclear and indistinct. And so the idea for the Jews that God should become a human being, become part of reality, this is a big reason why they reject Jesus. That God should take on humanity, because God and nature, like 2 different categories. And it is 2 different categories. That's why the incarnation, you just look at it and you can write books about it. We've done it for 2,000 years. But you can't, it's like the Trinity, trying to make everything line up where it makes like perfect mathematical sense. That does not apply to God. God gave us the ability to do amazing mathematical things, right? That there actually is this structure in reality that you can measure, but that's not God. But somehow we participate in God when we do it. So here's the last one. Other respondents describe spirituality as something larger and more creative than science, or a relationship with God, or connecting with the Creator, or living in accordance with the Bible, as being one with your soul, emotions, feelings, and actions. So that's pretty amorphous thinking about the spiritual, right? I say if you want the spiritual, you come and Jesus is food. And you participate in everything that he does. So most believe in God in our world, but what God is like, it's like if an atheist that tells you they don't believe in God, first question out of your mouth is, please describe for me the God you do not believe in. You know, and that's a tough one, because nobody will say, I don't believe that there's any basis for existence, ipsum esse subsistens, and that's how we think about God. The basis for that anything exists. And the only thing we can say about God is what he's revealed about himself or what we know about Jesus. Okay? Is this okay so far? All right. The center explored how many adults believe that people who have died can communicate with the living. This is really interesting. 42% of people think they can communicate with the dead. Do you know anybody who talks to the dead? There's a guy down in McGee that'll help you. I had someone take me to a seance when I was 18 years old, and it was creepy, but I never thought there was anything real about it. I know, but people do this stuff. That the dead can assist the living, 46%. Well, don't you believe Mary assists you when you pray? But do you believe that Joe Schmo, who lived next door, he's the one who's reaching out? That would be pretty interesting. That the dead can harm the living, 18%. And where do you find that? Mostly in Hollywood movies, right? The Evil Dead, starring Bruce Campbell, the greatest actor of his generation. Or that when you die, you're united with other loved ones who have already died, 57%. How many think that? Yeah, this is Christianity. But you think that because even if Christianity seems to be going down, we live in a Christian world. It's like, did anyone ever see the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe? Okay, do you remember his wife and kid get killed? His beautiful little daughter? But he has a vision of them running through grassy fields called, this is not the pagan idea of death. You could say it's kind of Christian, but this is not paganism. I mean, all you have to do is read pagan plays, read the Odyssey, and it's gruesome. The best you can do is be the emperor, and then you become God. Because that's where this idea of the supernatural separate from the natural comes from. You go up to where the gods are, which is not this world. About 45% of all survey respondents reported feeling a deep sense of wonder about the universe, or a deep sense of spiritual peace and well-being, or a sudden feeling of connection with something from beyond this world. Any of you ever feel that? I mean, this is the numinous experience, right? It's just the sense. I bless houses full of ghosts here probably several times a year. I always think that's one of the interesting things, how many people have experience of ghosts. And they either walk down the hall by them, the cat hisses, or what's another one? A little girl thinks her grandmother's following her around. And I always tell them the same thing because it's a really Catholic thing. And so you ever hear it, just say this. They want your prayers. And so just pray for them. This is what we do for the dead. It's the healthiest thing that we do. And so the Vatican and the supernatural. I'm going to try to get through this because I always talk way too much. But at the end, you want to hear what the Vatican has to say. So we're going to the second part, which is the history of the impossible. Here's the first thing. Where does the idea of the supernatural come from, right? Because it's an attempt to try to understand the world that we live in. Because we come out of a world where there are haunted houses, or I don't know if anyone believes in elves, leprechauns, trolls, goblins. Okay, fine. But this is the world of nature, right? That's what's really died about the enchanted world. I don't think anyone believes in that stuff. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it does mean that it doesn't have any role in our lives outside of a few Hollywood movies. And so the idea, you all know what secularism is? Do you think you understand what it is? Let me explain to you what Charles Taylor says secularism is. He says that Christianity created secularism. Can you believe that? So listen to what he says, because yes, he's right. So am I a religious priest or a secular priest? No, I'm a secular priest. Let me explain. Is in the Christian world, in the Catholic world, I should say, there's the regular and the secular clergy. And so regular, we've kind of changed the word where regular is like normal, right? Like, it's just regular that this happens. That's not what regular means. Regular comes from the Latin word regula, which means rule. Does that make sense? Okay. And so Benedictines, Augustinians, Carmelites, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, all the nuns, they all live by a rule. And the rule is usually something that the founder or the founders of the religious group put together. But I think I'm right. In all regular clergy that have a rule, there's three things there: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay? Now, I took a vow of obedience. I took a vow of chastity, but I did not take a vow of poverty. That's the difference between the secular and the regular clergy. As we say in the diocesan priesthood, the regulars take the vow of poverty. The secular priests live it. Not exactly true. But I always think that's one of our funny lines. And so And that's why, like for a priest, like in the medieval world, you would have a parish, and the parish was where you made your living, right? And the big difference between a parish in the year 1500 and a parish in 2024 is the bishop makes a rule about how much you can get paid. Okay? So its salary is the same for everybody, and that way you know if somebody's embezzling. Because they take more than they're entitled to. So that's the medieval idea of secularism. The difference between those who take the evangelical counsels and those that don't, and live in the saecula, which means the saecula is the world of time. Okay? So they're not living this ultimate life. Because in the medieval world, the king ruled, the knights fought, the monks prayed, and the people worked. That is the medieval world. And so that's the big thing which really is a big part of the Protestant Reformation, because in all the Protestant countries, they immediately destroyed the monasteries. And they banished celibacy clergy. You could not be a Lutheran minister and not marry, because they just made war on all of that. So here's what the next meaning of secularism is. Secularism means that you don't believe in God. I'm a secularist, which is there's just the world. Well, there are some people that describe themselves like that. But the third is really, I think, the going option in the United States. Belief in God in a secular world is optional. The God you believe in is optional. The nature of the supernatural is optional. U.S. versus Casey, a big case in 1982 on abortion, the presiding judge said that it is the essence of personal freedom that everybody gets to decide for themselves the meaning and purpose of life. Do you remember this? Okay. I mean, does everybody get to decide the meaning and purpose of gravity too? And so that what you're seeing there is the sense that it's not important, from this world up here. So I just have to tell you this because I don't want to forget it. They're two really good stories. So the Vatican comes out with these rules about secularism, right, which we'll talk about at the end. And so I read a BBC article on it because I always like the British take on stuff. Usually it's pretty snide. And so at the end of the article, talking about the Vatican and their rules for the supernatural, the author says, of course, this is an institution that still communicates with smoke signals. You remember when the Pope's elected? But it's a snide remark. When I talked about a book, and some of this comes from Dr. Carlos Ayers' book. He's a professor of history at Yale, was tenured at Virginia, and he's really an interesting guy. He's a Catholic guy, and he says he knew he was going to get blowback for writing a book called They Flew, about levitation. But I read, because I wanted to see what reviewers said about it. And one person reviewing it, all they did was go through, and they said, I don't know if this is the final copy or this is proof, but these were the typos I picked up. Now, how many reviews do you read that you care about what the typos were, right? And so that there is kind of a sneering in our culture about the supernatural. And so here's what Charles Taylor says, and it is a book worth reading, but it's like you have to wade through it. And when he describes what's happened between 1500 and 2024, it's really not linear, like the cue ball hits the 8 ball, which hits the 7 ball, which hits the 6 ball, and it goes into the right corner pocket. That's not how history is. It's ping pong. All the different things that influence. And so he would say the idea of personal spirituality replacing communal spirituality, because partly is there's not an anchor anymore. If you got to decide for yourself what makes the most sense, well, you're going to just drift. It's just, what's the options? There's nothing to keep you locked in. He said Newtonian physics, when you double down on that God is made everything, what's called special creation, that God made California king snakes, he made tarantulas, they made mice for California king snakes to eat, that kind of idea that God is this perfect blind watchmaker. And that was a dominant view of God, especially in Protestant nations in the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, that's pretty much what Darwin takes apart. And one of the things he points out is actually Alistair McGrath, a great Protestant and Anglican priest who writes on these things. He's got his doctorate in chemistry. He said the Protestants were so prejudiced against the Catholics, they would never bother to go back and read St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas. Because St. Augustine wrote the literal meaning of Genesis, where he said we could have evolved from lower beings. Maybe God did it this way. Thomas Aquinas said, God's called the prime mover, and the prime mover is not the first ball that hits the other balls. It's the reason why anything exists. Then he would say creation is full of secondary causes, and that the world unfolds according to what's already built into creation. And so that's why Catholics have not had a lot of problems with evolution. As saying evolution explains everything, well, you know, in evolution, the idea is how life begins on our planet as it came from another planet. Okay, now it's going maybe a little far for a scientific explanation. But that the sense that all the questions have been answered, right? And some people are like, well, science doesn't believe that. Science has disproved that. That may be coming apart a little bit. But what Charles Taylor calls is the immanent and the transcendent. And this, remember when I was talking about the supernatural, as if the world was a 2-story building? Are you still with me? You're breathing out there? So that the idea is there's these two different worlds, that you can find meaning just within this world on its terms. You don't have to refer to some world that is, well, think of everything you've ever said that's sneering and dismissive about the transcendent. You know, that ghosts don't exist because they can't exist. People don't rise from the dead because they can't rise from the dead. There are no miracles because miracles can't happen. That's David Hume. And so what do you do with all of this, according to Dr. Eyre, which I'm going to go through? And so I will leave the enchanted world with just this story, because it's not gone. Anyone ever hear of the Battle of the Leth? See, I love it coming up with these weird historical things that are very, very important. So between the death of Charlemagne and about 100 years, did you know that the most fearsome army in Europe were the Hungarians? They would apparently fuel up on goulash, and then they'd go on these massive raiding parties. And they would raid as far away as into Spain. They'd raid the Muslims in Spain, because the thing like the Huns, which were 4 centuries before, it's horsebacks and arrows. And European armies tend to be about armor. And so the Battle of the Leth is when the Hungarians are caught at Augsburg, which is in Bavaria, in 955. And King Otto, who then becomes the Holy Roman Emperor after his big victory, he takes German armored cavalry, and they catch them, corner them against the river, and basically he kills the entire army. I mean, it is a slaughter fest that goes on all day. This is the key. Bishop Ulrich, this is when bishops rode with armies, and they were armored warriors. You ever seen pictures like that? Well, this is the medieval era. What does he bring as his special weapon that guarantees victory? He brings the Spear of Destiny, the Spear of Longinus. Have you ever heard this? Yeah, it's the spear that in the medieval world was the relic preserved from the centurion who pierces Jesus' side. And when they bring that spear to the battle, that's what wins the war. That's the enchanted world. Does that make sense? There's all of this working on this one level. You know where you see it in the modern world? Does anybody here ever read The Lord of the Rings or see the movie? So do you know the story at all? Okay, then let me tell you the key part, because it's the Battle of Leth, but no one recognizes it. So Aragon, in the last book, The Return of the King, Aragon's the lost king, right? You think he was just this schmo, the writer, but really he's the lost king. And so everybody gathers around him, even the army of the dead's with him. Do you remember all of this? And do you remember what the elves give him? They give him Arundel, the flame of the west, which is the sword that was broken against Mordor at the last great battle. But now it's been reforged by the elves. And when he shows up at the gates of Minas Tirith with the flame of destiny in his hand, they sweep everything before them. And all the orcs and their big monsters all die. Longinus. It's the medieval world. Game of Thrones? You never watched it? Yeah, some of it was kind of tawdry. But that's the world. But it's just the medieval world. It's the medieval world without Christ. In The Lord of the Rings, Christ is there, he's never mentioned. But it's definitely good versus evil. In the Game of Thrones, who is good and who is evil? And so it's like taking that enchanted world where you have dragons and sorcerers and all of this stuff, but it's like everybody's the same. Like at the end, why was it such a horrible ending that everybody complained about? Because you didn't care who got the throne. Anyway, so here's the basic understanding in our culture, which Charles Taylor calls a subtraction story. And a subtraction story is what you learn in grade school. If you have 3 red cars and you take 2 away, how many are left? All right. That's a subtraction story. Okay. If you end up taking God and the enchanted world away, what do you end up with? Well, the subtraction story is you'd end up with secularism. Once it became impossible to believe in God, this is why we have the world that we have. But remember what I was reading at the beginning? How many people still believe in ghosts? How many people believe they still have a soul? It's never left. It just doesn't have any form. Because people are always going to believe that. And so Dr. Eyre wrote this book called, and this is where I get most, but you could go and read The Saint too. These are old stories. Jesus never levitated. Do you remember the story when the devil tempts Jesus? And you remember the last temptation? Take yourself up to the corner of the temple and throw yourself off and everyone will believe. Tempted to levitation. The only time he ever does that is the ascension. Does that make sense? But it's not really a huge part of his story. But levitation is not just a Christian story. It's throughout the world. When I got to the seminary in 1994, I met Father Jerry Higgins, a Capuchin. And we were all sit down, and he just said it. He said, I was in the convent with Father Solanus Casey. Do you know who he is? Okay. He's venerable. They're waiting. I think they've got a miracle about his canonization. And so people in that convent, and this is like the 1940s, 1950s, saw him levitate. He would levitate according to Jerry Higgins, who was a really good guy. He played the violin, and Jerry heard him play the violin. So he played it, but very badly. And so he would be in front of the Eucharist, and he'd play the violin, and he'd float. Do you believe that? People see it. Are they liars? What do you do with it? Because when I first heard that, I thought, gosh, that's a weird story. And that's why this book kind of got my attention. So anyway, he goes through the history of levitation. And it's also about how we think about sanctity and the history of the impossible, because I'm not going to spend time on bilocation, though that has a story where a Spanish nun in the 16th century allegedly bilocated into Texas. And Indians, native people from Texas, the Humanists, showed up in New Mexico asking to be baptized. And this is the historical record by Father Benavides, and you can read this. He was the Franciscan relator. The relations are missionaries write their stories. And so they showed and they said a lady in blue appeared. Now, this is the same time within 100 years of Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so he puts this story together with Maria Agreda, who is a lady who's famous for telling the Inquisition that she'd been in the New World. and it talked to the Indians about converting. And so bilocation, the reason, like Padre Pio, it's in his inquest about bilocation, the problem with bilocation is how do you put two people in two different places to witness the bilocation? And apparently talking on cell phones, yeah, you just got here. I mean, what's the proof? How could you do all of that? Okay, so it's a little different than 8 nuns see it and visitors to the convent see it on numerous occasions. St. Joseph Cupertino, he levitated in front of the Pope Urban VIII, who went on record saying, I'll be a witness at his canonization if he dies while I'm still alive. There was a prince from, he was a Lutheran. He converted to the Catholic faith after seeing him float up into the air while saying Mass. So are all these people liars? So, go through this a little bit. Have you ever heard of St. Catherine the Astonishing? Isn't that a great name? It's like, ladies, when your man looks at you and goes, you're amazing. Next time he says that, you look at him right in the eye and say, you mean I'm not astonishing? So anyway, a medieval saint, 12th century, known for levitation. Levitation is actually a 19th century word. St. Teresa of Avila had several names for it, but they were like euphemisms. Levitation, like gravitas, so that pulls you down. Levitas, you get it? And so that's the word they come up with it because of the number of people doing seances who would levitate. Almost all of them fakes. There was one guy that Ayres says was so good nobody ever caught how he did it. Okay? But Catherine of the Astonishing, what makes her story interesting, not just stuff, but it's at a time when they're not really thinking as much about holiness of life. They're really impressed with the fact that she levitates during Mass. When she died and they were burying her, they had her in an open casket, and the whole village showed up for the funeral. And the story of her funeral, she floats out of the casket, and everybody runs out of the church, except her sister and the priest who pray till she goes back down, then they bury her. Okay, well, St. Francis of Assisi, stories of him levitating. Also, he's the first known that has the stigmata, right? And so Joseph Cupertino, who actually lives just after Teresa of Avila, Maria Agreda, who lives after Teresa of Avila. The reason Dr. Ayres' book is so big is he goes through all of this in detail. And what he says as an historian is, you can't go back in history to test what happened. Like, it's not hard to believe that Robert E. Lee and the Virginians rolled out on the 3rd day of July, 1863, to attack the Yankees up on Cemetery Ridge. Fair enough? Because this is what armies do. And so nobody questions it. But there are multiple witnesses to all of these. And so the Mother, St. Teresa, Dr. Ayres said what got his attention on it, it's like I told you when I went to the seminary and Father Higgins talked about Solanus Casey. So he goes and he's going to Avila, which I've been to, and he goes to the convent of I think it's the Immaculate Conception, Immaculate Heart, I forget. But it's where she starts as a Carmelite nun. I've been there and went to the convent at St. Joseph. Avila is a really neat place to visit, one of the last walled cities in Spain. But he's sitting there, and they go through, and here's where her cell was. Here's the stairs where she fell down and hurt herself. Here's the kitchen, and here's the place where she and John of the Cross levitated. And over here, and he said, well, wait a minute. One of these things is not like the others. And it's when he just started to get interested in these stories. And so that, when she did all of these, what makes it interesting, it was in Spain during the Protestant Reformation. And so the Spanish Inquisition is on her. And I don't know if you've ever read the autobiography of St. Teresa of Avila. It's a Catholic classic. Okay, you can read it. It's just one of those things you can read. She talks about her spiritual life. They made her describe what it was like to levitate. She uses the word, I think it's ordenamiento or something like that. I can't remember. It's a Spanish word. She doesn't use levitation because it wasn't a word in usage in the 16th century. She's born, she's about 10 or 20 years younger than Martin Luther, but she's born just when the Protestant Reformation is breaking out in Germany. And so the Inquisition is clamping down on all of this stuff. So they make her write what's called the Vita. And so I'll read you some passages from there, what she said it felt like, because everybody said she hated doing it, and she prayed to God to stop, and it finally stopped. So, because partly is she wanted to reform the Carmelites. She didn't want the Inquisition poking their nose in. St. Teresa of Avila. The Holy Mother was very humble, and this is a nun named Sister Isabel de Santo Domingo in Procesos. The Holy Mother was very humble, and she dearly wished not to be considered as a saint. So she constantly begged me and her other daughters to pull down hard on her vestments whenever we saw her rising into the air. And whenever she'd begin to feel that the Lord wanted to elevate her, she'd grab onto the floor mats and the grills in the choir. At that very same instant, she'd also beg our Lord to stop bestowing such favors on her from now on. And one day she eventually attained this from our Lord. So that was testimony at her inquest from one of the nuns that lived with her. Here's what she wrote in her autobiography. Once when we were together in choir, this is Teresa's voice. Once when we were together in choir and about to take communion, and I was on my knees, it caused me the greatest anguish because it seemed to me a most extraordinary thing that would cause people to fuss over it intensely. So I ordered the nuns not to speak of it. On other occasions, when I have felt that the Lord was about to do this to me again, I have lain on the ground and the sisters have strained to hold down my body. But the rapture has been observed anyway, as once happened during a sermon on our patronal feast when some great ladies were present. Joseph Cupertino said the same thing. That he'd say, and everyone who heard him said he'd scream and then he would go into the air. They had one story about him, and we're not going to spend much time on it because I wanted to keep this under an hour. He floated up and landed on the top of a tree branch, and it was like a bird there. And he just floated there. And you'll see lots of paintings of Joseph Cupertino. And in fact, if you want, they made a great movie called The Reluctant Saint. It's on YouTube for free. Ricardo Montalban and Maximilian Schell. And it's really, it's like all Hollywood movies. It's the story, but they leave out that he was basically, they put him, because he was attracting so much attention, they put him into cells in Franciscan convents and wouldn't let anybody see him. They hid it away because of it. And so the Protestant Reformation had taken the position that all of that was demonic. And so everything was pretty much the devil for them. Because if the Catholic relics healed somebody, it was demonic power. Because it was all part of basically the rhetoric that went back and forth. And what it does is if only demons could do it, because in the first 100 or 200 years of the Protestant Reformation, they had a doctrine called the cessation of miracles. Have you ever heard this? So a Protestant doctrine was that all miracles had stopped in the year 100 with the death of St. John, the last of the apostles. And that meant that all the healing shrines, all the relics, all of these Catholic stories, they were all just feats of the devil. They did not deny that they happened. They denied that it was God. You get how it turns into this polemic? And so partly why she writes The Interior Castle right after her vision. And has anyone ever read The Interior Castle? It's another classic. All right, it's a classic Catholic thing. She walks in, it's dark night, she looks out, and there's these two lights by the door, these torches. For the first time, she can see the glittering eyes out in the dark, all the things that have been biting her. Like she tells her story when she first goes in. She has a boyfriend when she goes into the convent the first time. You know, she's not a saint from year one. but she has this conviction that she wants to be a saint. So the interior castle is, the first 4 mansions or 7 mansions, is cleansing from sin. And then the next 3 is her experiences of God and what she calls being ravished. Have you ever heard of the Transfiguration of St. Teresa of Avila? If you go to a church in Rome called Santa Maria de Vittoria, it's a famous sculpture. And as my teacher, Vince McNally, who is no great respecter, would say, it looks like she's having an orgasm because she's laying back like this and she's beautiful. And this angel's shoving a golden arrow into her. You cannot miss the imagery there. But that's ecstasis. Ecstasy means to stand outside yourself. The interior castle. The soul is often engulfed, or better said, the Lord engulfs it in himself. This claim is as significant as it is vague, according to Dr. Eyre. And so it's the even vaguer claim that the mystical union leads to a total transformation of the soul in God. Teresa's autobiography deals with these highest levels of rapture about union with God. And so the point of all of this is heaven is not a really good condominium and a nice convertible sports car. It's union with God. And so to prepare for that, here's Teresa, and not everything about it seems like it's what you think it would be, but it takes you outside of yourself. And so I wanted to leave this because otherwise you think it's like a credulous time when the church just believes anything. So during Teresa's time, for about another 50 years after, the Inquisition hammers 3 nuns who claimed to levitate, claimed to have miracles, but they proved they were frauds. And so these are the ones that Dr. Eyre points out. Magdalena de la Cruz, the nun of Cordoba, 1487 to 1560, who eventually confessed to being in league with the devil and ascribed her unnatural charism to him. Isn't that interesting? You know, Martin Luther had this strong belief in the devil. He once went into his room and there was a black dog in his room. And this is well attested. And he thought it was the devil, so he picked it up and he threw it out the window. And he would always talk about how he would fight with the devil. And he would curse him and really nasty stuff. And Luther's a strange guy by our standards. But that idea that people believe that you can make in league with the devil, well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Maria de la Visitacion, the nun of Lisbon, who was born in 1551. Teresa of Avila died in like 1582. And she died sometime after 1603. She eventually confessed to being a total fraud who cleverly tricked everyone into thinking her miracles were real. And then she also had some help in her convent because it was thought you'd bring more interest to the convent if you had a saint there. And so this is all following the attention given to Teresa of Avila. The third, Luisa de la Ascensión, the nun of Carrion, was eventually, she's born 1565, dies 1636. This is all Spain, Counter-Reformation. Was eventually declared innocent of fraud by the Inquisition 12 years after her death, but nonetheless ended up forever disgraced and consigned to oblivion through her humiliation. So it's not like they believed everything. So what happens with all of this, and it's the history of the impossible. Do you remember the witch trials? Like the Salem witch trial was just before the 18th century. So it was late 1600s, okay? Well, it had been going on for several years. Catholics and Protestants, same game. But the thing was that witches would fly through the sky to their secret orgies with Satan wherever they were. But in like all the testimony brings up, no one actually ever sees it, but they know that they're in league with Satan, so it means they must do that. Okay, but this is Dr. Richard E. Gallagher. He's a psychiatrist. He teaches. I didn't copy it down, but it's he's in New York. He teaches at one of the colleges in New York. I forget which one it is. Harvard, I think, or Yale, was where he gets his degree in psychiatry. But he's been a consultant on exorcisms, Catholics, Protestants, non-Christians. And so he has a lot of experience. He wrote a book, and he's board qualified, and it's called Demonic Foes. He says that as he starts out, one of his articles on it, because I got like a third of the way into the book, 20%, I thought, I'm not going to read this. It's just awful, you know? You can accept that this stuff happens at some level, but listening to it, no, I'm not going to do that. But you can do that if you want. Or Monsignor Stephen Rossetti, who is the Archdiocese of Washington exorcist, and he wrote a book called American Exorcist. And some people come in and they just struggle with dark things. Priests, you meet so many different people. And so I tell them that they can go online for this deliverance ministry with Father Rossetti, because that people struggle with dark feelings is not the same thing as being possessed. And for Dr. Gallagher, mostly, he says, it's mental illness. That's why you have psychiatrists involved before you can do an exorcism. But he tells us one story. He's asleep in bed, and suddenly his two cats just start slashing each other and wake him up, and he has to pick them up as they're clawing and put them into separate rooms. And so he goes back to sleep. When he gets up in the morning, his doorbell rings. So there's a Catholic priest he knows with this woman who has like this long black hair and eyeliner that goes up to her hairline. And she's just an odd one. And she introduced herself. She's a satanic priestess named Julia. And she says to him, hey, how'd you like those two cats last night? And so part of it is knowing stuff you wouldn't otherwise know, right? And so that's like the other end of all of this when we talk about the supernatural. We got 5 minutes to go, and I can finish up in 5 minutes, which makes me proud. And so the Vatican, this is the institution that still communicates in smoke signals, right? And so the biggest thing, like for instance, Medjugorje, people want to know why. Does everybody know what Medjugorje is? Okay. An alleged Marian apparition, and everyone's wondering why the Vatican isn't saying, because they're not always the simplest things. Garabandal, do you know what Garabandal is? A lot of people are committed to Garabandal, but again, it's been investigated twice, and the Vatican said nothing about it. Because sometimes it's just hard, I guess, to figure out what's actually going on, because they're mixed bags. And so here's what their new 6-part thing is. First, to say you don't have to believe in any of this. You don't have to believe that Mary appeared at Fatima or Lourdes. This is not what salvation is based on. Salvation is based on exactly what Jesus says. You live a moral life. Forgive others. Show mercy and you'll be shown mercy. Receive the sacraments. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. Everybody on board with that? The ordinary means of sanctification. But as for these other things, like there's like 70 miracles of healing at Lourdes, and when people are really desperate, they go to Lourdes, they go to God. So the first thing is, if they investigate and there's nothing that would say this is wonky, this may actually be the real thing, the best you can do is call Nihil Obstat, which is exactly what you get if you're trying to print a book on theology. There's no obstacle here. Nihil Obstat, no obstacle. Doesn't mean you have to believe it, but it's just the Vatican saying, we're not seeing anything. Then the second one is pre oculis habeatur. It means you can believe it, but you should keep in mind, because there is something that's caused concern. Like, for instance, have you ever heard of La Salette? La Salette, a Marian apparition in the Alps. The two visionaries there kind of went on and lived lives that were not particularly saintly. And so, what the heck? How do you say you saw Mary, but then your choice is like St. Bernadette Soubirous, body still incorrupt in Nevers. I went and visited there when I went to Lourdes with my sister and Father Crino. The third possible ruling is called curator, or it's to be taken care of. That there's just some things that you have to think, okay, And then submandato, which means under command, which is be given when the critical issues do not involve the alleged phenomena, but the person or people involved who are misusing it. So one of the problems with Medjugorje, the Pope Francis, I don't know if you ever said that the visionaries would go around and they'd have visions here and there, and you could fly in, they'd give you a presentation, and there'd be a vision in what your parish or wherever they're doing this. And so what Pope Francis said is, Our Lady is not a postmistress. And so when you see that behavior, antenna go up. And so that's submandato, and that may be where Medjugorje is, if you listen to what the Pope says. But some people don't. Then prohibitor et obstruator. It's forbidden and obstructed, which means stay clear. Do you remember Conyers? Does anybody remember Conyers? Am I the only person who pays any attention to this stuff? Okay. Well, shame on you, because this is so interesting. So she was a visionary right outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And on my way to visit Flannery O'Connor, who I love, I thought I'd stop at Conyers, and nothing was going on. But it was like a month or so after she said she had a vision, and the vision that Her Lady gave us was that there was an invasion on the West Coast, and she said it looked like the Chinese, that they were going to invade the country. I said, well, yeah, but usually just coming over the southern border, right? So then the last one is called Declaratio de non supernaturalitate, which means definitely not supernatural. Like I would say, Our Lady appearing nightly up in Eloy, or in the side of a mesquite tree, or on an overpass in Chicago in the ice. And so, the history of the impossible. Does stuff happen? Well, can I tell you my story? I have miracle stories, but no one's as impressed with them as I am. But the one thing that really made me, when I talk to people who see ghosts, when I was in the seminary, the first time, I was 18 years old, pretty impressionable. And, it's in the mid-70s, which is not a high point in Catholic history. Fair enough? Can we just all agree on that? And so, I won't go into the rest of it, because it wasn't the only thing. But they told us this story about this Carmelite who was a principal at Joliet Catholic High School in Joliet, Illinois, who had been drinking, driving, was in a single car accident, instantly killed. And then they said that, like at South Point and other Carmelite houses, they'd see him walking down the hall. And this is like ghost stories. It's like they never seem to speak to people. They're always just going someplace, or you look up and they're standing in the door. This is mostly when people talk to me about them, what the thing is. Although one lady said that they moved their bed to sweep under there, and the ghost was lying under their bed. Now that's a creepy story. So it would only be worse if the ghost was under there smoking. So anyway, I was... the other guys, and I think at some point there was like 15 to 20 guys in this kind of laid-back formation program that the Carmelites were trying out, which I think we had 3 guys from my senior class went, and none of us lasted longer than 2 years. There's a reason for where the church is at today. But they told me this ghost story, and so imagine the Carmelite habit, which is a brown habit with a brown scapular, and then they have a white cloak. Have you ever seen that? Like Father Serge will sometimes wear his cloak when he wants to look super mysterious. But it's white and black. But anyway, it's white and brown. And a hood. They have a hood because it's a Mendicant order, starts in like the 12th century, so it still has these monastic kinds of overtones. So I'm laying in bed, I'm looking at this wall, and I feel this prickle on my back of my neck, and I turn around, and I will tell you that standing from here to here was exactly what I described. And I said, Mark, you're not scaring me. Because we were kind of tight, so we were sharing rooms. Mark, I can't remember his last name, nice guy. But I thought they had like put on this and they were punking me. And I said, you don't scare me. I mean, it was that real. And then I reached out and I slugged it in the stomach, and then there was nothing there. Because I didn't think of it as a ghost. I mean, that's how real it was to me. Never moved. Was holding the clipboard under its arms, just like it had been described. And I sat in my bed, because the guys were out in the kitchen, because I hear them. I sat in my bed and thought, what the heck was that? And the moonlight was coming through the window on the far end of the bedroom, which wasn't a huge bedroom. And I thought, was it just light playing on my eyes? You know? And so what I would say about the whole thing, that has had zero impact on my life. I don't run around trying to take pictures of ghosts. I don't care. But when I talk to people, I say, well, you know, I know how it can feel very real because this was my experience of it. And so all I did was pray. And I would say coming out of the seminary, that experience, I was the only 18-year-old guy I knew who went to Mass every day until I went back into the seminary, like 20 years later. And I couldn't explain to you why I made that decision. I'm sure it made perfect sense at the time. But it wasn't that I was scared or anything like that, but just the love of the Eucharist. And so that's, I'd like to say I had some insight, but I can understand why the supernatural seems so real. I just love what St. Teresa of Avila said about it. It's not God. This is God's world, but that is not what God is. Does that make sense? And so in all of these things, when she complains about it, you know, she's not attracting attention to herself. It's not really why anybody reads her today. They want to read about what it's like to have these mystical experiences, because she and John of the Cross are two mystics. And mysticism is its own thing. But does it generally involve levitation? Well, St. Solanus Casey, it was like something medieval when Jerry Higgins mentioned that. But I just think, for Catholics, if you don't believe in the supernatural, what are you going to do about the resurrection? That there's a world out there we don't understand? I think you just accept that. That all these stupid people that run around taking pictures of it, you know what Gallagher says about it in Father Monsignor Rossetti? He says, you never do that, because there's no way of knowing what you're dealing with. And so just don't be interested in it. Just remember what the road to sanctity looks like. And that's the best thing that Catholics can do. Fair enough? Any questions, as long as they don't involve math? Or should we just close with a prayer? Okay. Well, let's close with a prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. The Lord be with you. And with your spirit. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. How was it? Well, no one ran screaming. So next month it'll be called Cosmic Connections. And it's really based on what people do who don't believe in the resurrection. You don't quit being religious. You obviously don't quit believing in the supernatural. So what do they do with it? I think those are interesting questions. Okay? Good night, everybody. Would you give me a minute? I'm going to turn this off and I'll be right back. Otherwise, we're just talking into the mic.
Okay.